The media plays an important role in informing and educating the public on a wide variety of issues, from politics to weather to internet trends. Yet, as media in America has progressed, it has begun to take on a very different role, a role where facts and objective presenting takes a back seat, and where opinion and divisive commentary takes center stage. What has become apparent in this change is how biased major news organizations have become, supporting political trains of thought rather than objective lines of thought. This then begs the question, how did American news media become so politically biased, and how has it become an issue in the modern day? Let's start with the history of politically biased news media in the US. The notion that news media had to be objective is a relatively newer belief. In fact, the newspapers of the 19th century featured heavy political bias. These newspapers were almost always biased and almost always had clear ties to, quote, particular political parties and the economic interests of their publishers. This sentiment was echoed in how newspapers covered various events. An example of this being two newspapers of the San Francisco Gold Rush era, the San Francisco Alta California, which was, quote, an enemy of the Democratic Party governor of California, and the Stockton Republican, a newspaper staunchly in favor of the governor. Newspapers of this time were highly sensationalist, often embellishing or dramatizing events that they reported, rather than simply presenting the facts consistently and consistent with modern standards. Comments that would usually find themselves in an editorial section today were often sprinkled throughout regular reporting. Nonetheless, some did call out for fairer, more objective news, but it was simply thought to be, quote, rhetorical camouflage for the editorial opinions sown throughout most news stories. The real changes to the media system came in the 50s and 60s. Journalism changed altogether during that period. The job became what we would call a profession. Qualifications were needed to work as a journalist, qualifications that could only come from a university degree. What is more interesting to note are the claims that universities of this era were more liberally minded. Indeed, a separate issue stems from this, the issue of the many liberal colleges and universities. Nonetheless, the sudden influx of liberally educated journalists meant that a viewpoint previously in the minority was suddenly brought to the forefront of the view of the public. This meant that all large public issues at the time got the liberal viewpoint as well. From the Vietnam War to Watergate, a more liberal viewpoint was present, allowing a discussion to emerge. This originally was a good thing, but circumstances changed that. The internet brought on a monumental shift in how people were able to process and understand news. This internet age meant that large groups of people were constantly on the search for information. Coupled with new priorities centered around viewer numbers, the media changed to accommodate and become the mouthpiece for sensationalist, biased news that would shock viewers into keeping the TV on. This age of sensationalism brought on a new age of political bias, where news networks stuck to endorsing viewpoints, conservative or liberal, and then ensured that they were supporting their viewers' assertions, and thus polarizing the other side of the aisle. The consequences of this mean that it becomes more difficult to accept and understand another's viewpoint or perspective. It becomes more difficult to remain open-minded because everything and everyone else is saying, be closed-minded, thus freezing out any ability to meaningfully discuss or debate any number of issues. And without talk, there can be no progress. So, let's recap. American news media often had bias, made evident through the newspapers of the 19th century. As the profession of journalism changed, however, so did the people presenting the news. Then, as the internet emerged, news networks began focusing on viewer counts, meaning that they had to keep their viewers engaged by sensationalizing events. They also began to follow political trains of thought rather than factual trains of thought. The consequences of this? Polarization and eventual discontinuation of meaningful discussion.